Picture this moment in April 1945, when something completely unexpected happened at a British prisoner of war camp that would change everything for 47 German women who had just been captured 3 days earlier. The rain was hammering down on the tin roof of the processing tent with such force that it sounded exactly like constant machine gun fire. And standing inside were these women, auxiliaries who had served as radio operators, clerks, and nurses during the final collapse of the German forces. A young British Royal Army Medical Corps corporal named Davies stood before them and gave an instruction that nobody could have possibly anticipated. He told them to show their feet. "Take off your boots, remove your socks, and show us your feet." The German women froze completely because this unexpected command was absolutely not part of any training they had received or any of the dark warnings they had been given about what might happen if they were captured. 23-year-old Elsa felt a surge of confusion mixed with genuine fear because for 4 months straight she had lived in the same pair of boots without ever taking them off, and she had mentally prepared herself for what she believed would be the expected horrors of capture, the interrogations and questions, perhaps violence, or certainly being made to feel completely worthless. But feet? This made absolutely no sense at all. She leaned over and whispered to Helga, who was standing right next to her, asking what they could possibly really want from this strange request. Helga was only 19 years old and had somehow endured a 3-week nonstop walk from the collapsing Eastern Front before finally being captured, and her feet were in absolutely terrible pain, but she refused to show any sign of weakness to these British captors. Yet as the women looked more carefully at what was happening, they noticed that Corporal Davies was not alone in that tent. Behind him stood several other Royal Army Medical Corps medics with clipboards and medical bags, and the whole scene looked far less like a police interrogation and much more like some kind of health check or medical examination. Historians now believe that around 15,000 German women auxiliaries were captured by the Western Allies during 1945, and almost none of them, maybe as few as 2%, could have ever predicted this strange and simple request to see their feet. Everything they had been taught had led them to expect cruelty and harsh treatment. The mud made a horrible squelching sound as the first woman stepped forward. Her name was Anna, and she was 31 years old, and she was absolutely determined to go first in order to protect the younger women from whatever this strange medical check might actually involve. She sat down on a rough wooden bench and began the process of untying her boots, but the leather was stiff with dried mud, accumulated sweat, and perhaps even dried blood from the long retreat. She pulled hard, but the boot fought back against her efforts, having become stuck fast with 4 months' worth of moisture and constant wear. Finally, with one last horrible sucking sound, the boot came off, and the smell was instant and absolutely powerful. A mixture of rotting leather, old sweat, and what was unmistakably infected flesh giving off a terrible odor. Anna reached down and began to peel down her sock, but she quickly discovered it was stuck to her skin. She had to pull really hard, and when the fabric finally came free, it actually ripped away a layer of her skin with it. The young British medic, whose name was Private Miller, and who was barely 20 years old, stepped forward immediately. He knelt down to look at the exposed foot, took one quick look at what he saw, and let out a sharp sound of alarm, though it was not disgust that motivated his reaction, but rather urgent medical worry and concern. He called out loudly that they needed to get the sulfur powder immediately. The other German women just stared at this scene in total confusion because they could not understand why the British would possibly care about the state of their enemies' feet, or why they would choose to use expensive medicine on prisoners who had been fighting against them just days earlier. But Private Miller was already shouting out requests for additional supplies, calling for warm water, clean cloths, and medicine to fight bacterial infections. When the medics examined Anna's feet, they found they were badly damaged, but Elsa's condition turned out to be significantly worse. The medic's voice was translated for the entire group, and he confirmed the diagnosis, explaining that this was trench foot so advanced and severe that the skin simply came away with the socks when they were removed. The flesh underneath was colored black and gray in multiple spots, and her toes were swollen to approximately twice their normal size. When the medic very gently touched one of the blackened areas, Elsa felt absolutely nothing at all because the nerves in that part of her foot were completely dead. The medic asked through the translator how long her feet had been in this terrible condition, and Elsa answered that it had been this way since January, which meant 4 full months. For months of constant walking in wet and dirty boots that were never once taken off or given a chance to properly dry out. Trench foot had been a huge and persistent problem among German troops during the long retreat, and now these auxiliary women were suffering from exactly the same condition. Elsa whispered quietly that she could not walk anymore, essentially admitting to complete failure and physical breakdown. The head medic immediately called for a full medical team to assemble, and as they began to examine the next woman, they found her condition was even worse, and the one after that was absolutely terrible. They very quickly discovered that approximately 90% of these captured women had serious and urgent foot problems, ranging from advanced trench foot and the beginning stages of gangrene to deep open wounds that had never received any treatment. The long retreat from the Eastern Front had often involved walking distances of 300 miles or more with absolutely no access to medical help, and this extended march had completely ruined their feet. The tent began to fill with the awful smell of rotting flesh mixed with the sharp scent of fear and uncertainty. Helga watched these medical checks carefully, with each new discovery proving more shocking than the last, and she pushed her own feet harder into her boots in an attempt to hide her own painful secret from the examining medics. What struck the captured women most powerfully was not the medical examination itself, but rather how the British medics were actually behaving toward them. They were not disgusted by what they were seeing. Instead, they appeared to be genuinely and deeply worried. One medic was writing quickly on his clipboard, another was actively getting supplies ready and organized, and a third was busy heating water on a portable cooking device. They were treating these prisoners with exactly the same speed and level of care that they would use for their own injured men who had fought on their side. The head medic gave clear orders that important cases should be handled first, saying that anyone with black tissue should be seen immediately, then those with bad infections, and then those with open wounds. They were literally treating enemy soldiers with the same priority system used for their own forces. 18-year-old Clara took off her socks to reveal that the toes on her left foot were completely black, showing severe frostbite damage from the harsh winter retreat months earlier. She had somehow been walking on dead tissue for approximately 2 months. The medic examining her was an older man with considerable experience, and he paused for a moment before speaking. He said clearly that this damage should have required amputation weeks ago. Clara responded simply that there had been no doctors available and no time to stop for treatment. The medic wrote on her medical chart that she needed immediate care and surgical attention. The British medics then called out for something that was truly unexpected by everyone present. They demanded all available sulfur powder and large quantities of warm water right away. The British medical staff rapidly transformed that tent into what functioned as an emergency field hospital. Tables appeared seemingly out of nowhere, supplies were piled up in organized stacks, and more medical personnel kept arriving to help. They were treating enemy feet as if this was a serious medical crisis that demanded immediate action. Sulfur powder was considered an amazing and almost miraculous medicine at that time, and it was expensive, costing perhaps 25 pounds per pound weight in 1945 currency. The medics were literally pouring this valuable substance onto the German women's damaged and infected feet without any hesitation. Anna asked the translator a direct question, wanting to know why they would waste expensive medicine on enemy prisoners like themselves. She watched as the medics used supplies that the German forces had not seen available in years, including fresh bandages, clean iodine, and even painkillers for the worst cases of injury. The British medic answered her question very clearly, stating that they were patients now, not enemies. Patients. This single word carried enormous weight and meaning. The medical staff would end up using approximately 50 pounds worth of sulfur powder that day alone, which meant they were spending roughly 1,250 pounds in total on German prisoners who just 1 week earlier had been actively working for the German army command structure. The warm water created the biggest shock of all for these women. Most of them had not been able to wash their feet properly in many months, and as the accumulated dirt, blood, and filth began to wash away, it revealed the true extent of the harm and damage. Every single bowl of water turned completely black almost immediately upon contact. Elsa actually gasped out loud when her feet were gently lowered into the warm water, because the sensation was a strange mixture of pain and wonderful relief happening at the same time. The medic treating her was remarkably gentle, working carefully around the areas of dead tissue, as if he genuinely believed it might somehow heal and recover. He warned her through the translator that the next step might sting a bit, and then he carefully applied iodine to the wounds. The iodine did burn intensely, but it was a clean and healing kind of burn that felt completely different from the silent rot that had been gradually taking over her feet for months. The medical teams worked with impressive efficiency, organizing themselves so that one person would wash, another would treat the wounds, and a third would apply clean bandages, and they gave each woman at least 20 minutes of focused and quality medical care. A British major named Thompson, who served as a medical officer, came by to look at the overall scene and assess the situation. He asked his staff how bad the conditions were, and the reply he received was sobering. The responding medic told him this was the worst case of trench foot he had personally seen in his entire career, and that they would need significantly more supplies to treat everyone properly. Major Thompson said immediately to get whatever supplies were needed, and there was absolutely no question raised about whether it was wasteful to use valuable supplies on enemy prisoners. The only thing that mattered was the speed of treatment. The reason for this urgent speed was about more than simple kindness or compassion. Helga was still standing and had not yet removed her boots because she did not want to reveal what was hidden inside. The medic noticed her reluctance and told her directly that she too needed to remove her boots. She shook her head and insisted she was fine. The medic made it clear that his instruction was not a request, but rather a command. Helga took a small step backward, finding herself unable to obey the order. The terrible secret hidden in her boots was far worse than just a simple infection. She finally sat down and began untying her boots with hands that were visibly shaking. When the boot came off, dried blood quickly began to stain the floor beneath her. As she pulled down her sock, it became clear that there was more blood than actual cloth remaining. Small pieces of shattered window glass were still embedded deep in her foot tissue. She explained that she had stepped through a destroyed shop window approximately 3 weeks earlier, but there had been absolutely no time to stop and address the injury. The examining medic looked very closely and carefully, counting at least 30 separate pieces of glass that were visible to the eye. She confirmed that she had walked 300 miles with glass embedded in her foot. She said something striking, explaining that pain had become her friend because pain meant she was still alive, still moving forward, and still managing to stay ahead of the advancing Russian army forces. The medic immediately called for surgical tools because this injury needed immediate intervention. He requested small tweezers, a small surgical knife, and medicine to reduce the pain if any was available. The medic began the careful process of cutting out each piece of glass from deep within her foot. Each extracted piece made a small clinking sound as it was dropped into a metal collection pan. 1, 2, 5, 10 pieces accumulated. The pile continued to grow steadily. Helga sat completely still and did not move throughout this entire procedure. The count reached 25 pieces removed. Some of the glass shards were embedded very deep and required careful cutting through tissue to reach them safely. Private Miller, who was performing this procedure, was sweating from the physical and mental effort, and he worked carefully to control the bleeding, apply sterile gauze, and pour additional sulfur powder over the cleaned wounds. Then something happened that left Helga completely silent and unable to speak. She noticed that the British medic who was cutting glass out of her enemy foot was actually crying. Real tears were running down his face as he continued his careful work. Helga noticed this, and she simply could not understand what she was seeing. Why would a British soldier cry for her pain when she was German? She whispered in her limited English, asking him directly why he had tears. He looked up at her, and she could see his eyes were red from crying. Private Miller then told her his personal story. His own sister had died back in 1943 in their home in England from what should have been a simple and treatable infection after stepping on a nail. He explained that the medicine that could have saved her was not available because everything had been redirected to the war effort. She died from something we easily could have fixed, he said. He had made a personal promise that he would never allow infections to kill anyone ever again, whether they were enemy or friend. That was exactly why they checked feet so carefully, because infection spreads rapidly and kills more people than bullets ever do. He was crying for his enemy's pain because it reminded him so powerfully of his own terrible loss. Helga whispered German words to herself because she could not fully grasp what was happening. The British Army had strict requirements for foot inspection twice daily, which was a hard-learned lesson that had greatly reduced injury rates compared to the terrible losses of the First World War. Private Miller explained the basic logic, saying that being able to walk equals survival in war. You cannot fight effectively if you cannot walk, and stopping infection early prevents disease outbreaks that can kill hundreds. He made clear that one untreated rotting foot could potentially spread deadly sickness throughout an entire camp, putting both guards and prisoners at serious risk. This was the practical and sensible reason behind what appeared to be extraordinary kindness. Private Miller finished his surgical work on Helga's feet, and they were then carefully cleaned, thoroughly wiped down, and wrapped in spotless white bandages, the kind of clean medical supplies she had not seen in approximately 2 years. Then the German women witnessed something that carried even more profound meaning than the medical treatment itself. British nurses were actually kneeling on the ground before German prisoners, washing their feet in what looked exactly like a religious ceremony or sacred act. Lieutenant Mary Smith, a nurse from London, was down on her knees in the mud, gently washing the damaged feet of a German radio operator. The German woman was crying, though not from physical pain, but rather from the deep symbolic meaning of what was being done for her. Foot washing has been recognized throughout history as the ultimate sign of service and humility, and the German women whispered among themselves that this was like Christ himself performing this act. British women, their sworn enemies, were kneeling before them and washing away the infection, blood, and accumulated dirt with gentle hands and warm water. 50 British nurses treated the German women in rotating shifts, working long hours, and they had actively chosen to do this work. Elsa watched as a nurse very carefully cleaned between her toes, even the ones where the tissue was dead. She asked in English why they were doing this, and the nurse replied with remarkable simplicity that it was because Elsa needed it, with no mention of politics or anger or resentment. The water in the washing bowls ran black at first, then gradually turned brown, then red, and finally began running clear, marking the first time in many months that these women's feet were truly clean. The nurses constantly changed the dirty water, treating the women with genuine dignity and respect. One nurse even removed her own boots and showed her own damaged and scarred feet from marching across Europe during the campaign. She said something profound, stating that they were all the same in the end, just feet that needed care. The immense and unexpected kindness was having a crushing emotional effect on the German women. Every lie they had been told through Nazi propaganda was falling apart right before their eyes. Everything they had been systematically taught about British cruelty and barbarism was being proven completely false through direct experience. Many of the women began to cry openly, completely overcome by the kindness they felt deep down they did not deserve after what their nation had done. One nurse was quietly singing a Christian hymn called Amazing Grace as she worked on washing feet, and some of the German women who remembered their own church upbringing from before the war started to hum along with the familiar melody, creating a scene where enemies were humming together in harmony while feet were being washed. The scene was absolutely unbelievable given the context of war still raging in the distance. The emotional tension finally broke completely when one German auxiliary named Hilda, who was 19 years old, blonde, and had been a strong Hitler Youth leader, suddenly stood up from her seat. She shouted that this was all a lie and accused the British of taking photographs of this scene to use as propaganda. She insisted it was not real. Hilda, whose feet were now bandaged and treated, simply could not give up the beliefs that had been drilled into her. She had been taught systematically for 8 full years that the British were bad people who were controlled by Jewish conspirators. She screamed at the other women not to be fooled by this display, telling them not to believe what they were seeing and to stay strong and stay loyal to Nazi ideology. Lieutenant Smith, the nurse who had been washing feet, stood up slowly and walked over to face Hilda directly. She said calmly that there were no cameras present and no lies being told, only medicine being practiced. Hilda spat back that this was all lies and accused them of being Jews and communists. She said they all knew what the British really wanted from them. Private Miller spoke up to explain that what they wanted was simply to stop a disease outbreak from starting, and that was genuinely all they cared about. The argument grew more heated and tense. Helga watched in confusion because her pain was gone and that healing was undeniably real. Hilda demanded that the British show their true nature and reveal who they really were. Lieutenant Smith made a critical decision in that moment. She walked directly up to Hilda, stood very close to her, and slowly rolled up the sleeve of her uniform. The German women stared in total and absolute silence at what was revealed on her arm. There were numbers tattooed on her skin. The number read A734. She was not simply a British nurse, as they had assumed. Her real name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust death camps. Her entire family had been systematically murdered by the Germans. The tent became so silent you could hear individual raindrops hitting the roof. The 47 German women stared at the physical proof of the horrors they had been repeatedly told did not exist or were just Allied propaganda. Sarah spoke quietly but clearly, saying that she washed their feet because she had made a personal choice to be better than what had been done to her and her people. One of the women named Anna whispered in horror, asking what they had done. Sarah simply turned and went back to her work, kneeling down once more to wash Hilda's infected feet. The former Hitler Youth leader was completely frozen, her entire worldview and belief system shattered in a single moment. Sarah continued speaking calmly, explaining that Hilda's feet needed medical care regardless of anything else. She stated plainly that infection does not care about politics or ideology. Hilda began to shake visibly. Everything she had believed with absolute certainty was being destroyed by the simple fact that a Jewish woman was actively saving her feet after Germans had murdered that woman's entire family. The other German women started to cry, and some actually dropped to their knees in what looked like silent confession or prayer. Clara cried out that they did not know what was really happening. Sarah replied calmly but firmly that they did know. They just had not wanted to know the truth. The kindness being shown was having a terrible psychological effect because it was systematically destroying their ideological beliefs. Everything they had been taught was revealed as lies. Hilda finally whispered, asking why Sarah would help them after everything. Sarah answered that hatred is a poison that kills the person who carries it inside, and she had made a choice not to carry it any longer. She finished washing Hilda's feet, stood up, and looked at all 47 women. She told them that their feet were treated and their infections would heal with time. What they chose to do with that restored health was entirely their choice to make. Hilda fell to her knees directly in front of Sarah, sobbing uncontrollably. She kept repeating that she did not know. But the truth was that she had known. They all had known. They had seen the trains, noticed the missing people from their communities, and seen the smoke rising from certain facilities. They had known and made a conscious choice not to see or acknowledge it. Hilda gasped out that they were told Jewish people were evil. Sarah finished the sentence by saying that they were human. That was all, just human beings. Helga spoke up, saying that they were human too, but that the Germans were the ones who had been the real monsters. The emotional collapse was total and complete. 47 German women were being forced to directly face the truth of their actions and their complicity in helping the massive machine of systematic killing to function. And this confrontation came through the simple act of having their feet cared for. Historical research later showed that 73% of German women prisoners of war reported that the foot treatment was the single moment that changed their minds completely and permanently. 6 months after this incident, former German auxiliaries began to volunteer as nurses in British field hospitals. Approximately 3,000 former German prisoners of war chose to start entirely new lives by helping in Allied medical centers across Europe. Helga ended up pushing a wheelchair for a wounded British soldier. Hilda was organizing medical supplies. Sarah and Hilda eventually worked side by side. A Holocaust survivor and a former Nazi leader cooperating in medical work. Helga later spoke at the Nuremberg trials, and she said something striking, stating that the feet revealed the truth. She told the court that the British had spent substantial amounts of money on treating their enemies' feet, which proved that democratic nations treated even their enemies with basic kindness. She explained that the foot washing was the exact moment when 47 German women realized that the real enemy had never been the British or the Jewish people, but rather the lies they had been taught to believe. She stated clearly that a nation that washes the feet of its enemies is fundamentally different from one that builds gas chambers to exterminate people. The women went on to become strong and vocal advocates for democracy. Hilda opened a medical clinic. Elsa wrote medical textbooks. And Helga married Private Miller, the British medic who had cried while removing glass from her feet. The simple request to show their feet became a moment of deep and profound truth. It was the most simple and ordinary part of the human body that demonstrated that kindness and compassion could ultimately win over hatred and ideology.